First, I would like to give you a little background information about this presentation and about our work in India. This project has been going on for the past year, so we've just finished our first year. And our first year has been more theoretical. I have an MA, used this research as part of my master's thesis, and I got so much information in my research of which I can only share a small part with you today. So this presentation will only be a small part. In India, as you can see from the slide, it's not very clear exactly how many sign language users there are in India. We don't know exactly, we don't have precise statistics. There are countries in Europe and the United States, for example, where they have more precise statistics. But we estimate that there are about 1.5 million sign language users in India. And sign language is used by this 1.5 million people, although there are other hard of hearing and deafened people who may not use sign language. It's very difficult to get exact statistics. India, as you know, is a very large country, and there are many different languages spoken in our country, and many different sign language dialects. Although in the research, we have found that there is clearly one Indian Sign Language ISL. Spoken languages and regional dialects among hearing people are much more diverse than among the deaf population. The structure of the Indian Sign Language seems to be very common to deaf people all across the country. There is no official national legislative recognition of sign language in India. So that is one of our goals in the work, is to get official recognition of sign language, especially since other countries are doing that as well. We had our first training in 2001 for sign language. There are many schools for the deaf in India, and there are many students in those schools. But there seems to be very little education for Indian deaf people beyond the 10th grade. The average that Indian deaf people go to school is only for 7 years. So there's very little university training. And Indian deaf people are tracked for more vocational studies rather than academic studies. There are 550 schools for the deaf in India. But only 5% of deaf Indians go to school, or go to these schools. Some of them are mainstreamed in their local community schools, and some of them don't go to school at all. So if only 5% are going to these deaf schools, we're not sure exactly what's happening with the other 95%, and that's a huge problem. As I say, many of them are tracked for vocational studies, manual labor training in vocational studies. We have the Tamil language in the south, which is restricted to a very small area. And that area seems even more isolated than the rest of the country in terms of deaf education. First, I'd like to talk about our research. Our research happens in Bombay. That's where we've been conducting our research. And the research project is dealing with the teaching of English. When we first announced the project, there were over 400 people who were interested. So we interviewed those people and we constituted two groups. One group with no previous knowledge of English, whose family spoke no English at home, who never got English at school, and the other group with some exposure to English, maybe 1 or 2 years, who may even have known how to fingerspell some English words. So they had some awareness of the functioning of English. And we thought we would research curriculums for the two groups, and the students were taught 6 hours a week for 1 year. And we collected the data from the research study. We haven't analyzed all of the data yet. It's written work. We know there's been a lot of research in addition. And we wanted to see what the differences might be in our country, a developing country. We know that some of the students were taught in sign language only by deaf teachers, which might be a very different situation from other countries. And we hypothesized also that if they already had a basic knowledge of sign language, English as a second language. In the massive data that we collected, we picked out the data that we thought was most important for us in our study of acquisition of English as a second language. Students gave their permission to use emails, and we would keep all of their correspondences confidential for the collection of data. We also videotaped the teaching of English for that group who had never had any exposure to English but only knew sign language. And we asked them in videotaped interviews how they felt about their progress in learning English. In these exit videotapes, we were able to compare their progress in English with the videotapes taken when they first started learning English, and we asked them for their own self-assessment of their progress. And we compared between the two groups, those that had been exposed to English and those that had no exposure to English. We wanted them first to self-assess. And the students felt very comfortable and motivated and felt even that their lives had changed because of their learning of English only in that 1 year. They felt they had learned quite a bit of English, emailing each other, using MSN, the Microsoft network, and that was full of new sources of information for the students. And in 1 year, we saw a big progression in how much they mouthed. Time is very short. I'm sorry if I'm signing a little bit fast, but we do need a lot more literacy, deaf literacy research in how deaf people acquire English as a second language. But this is a first step for us. We don't want to publish too much research without making sure that it will be. There are 3 centers that were just established in the last year. And now more and more deaf people in India are joining in this National Deaf Literacy Project from the Indian deaf community. We're also working with the team at UCLan, which have the academic expertise, which are giving us a lot of advice about collecting research data, and we're using postgraduate research assistants. We also have a lot of support from funding bodies, including the Deaf Empowerment Foundation from New Zealand. Not New Zealand, the Netherlands. Now we're working towards an undergraduate degree in sign language linguistics. We have 40 students, 400 students. From the 9 deaf schools in the area. These students are now, although they were very oral growing up, are becoming very fluent in sign language and are studying for their BA in Applied Sign Linguistics. We've been working with Islands and UCLan to develop a curriculum for Applied Sign Linguistics. You see, these partnerships have resulted in distance education, student exchange, research cooperation, and sandwich programs. And there is now a video relay center in India, where we can sign with each other, telephone each other, and sign with each other. Present some of our lectures in distance learning for people in the different centers.
I've met her.
So it's an official language, but not everyone knows Hindi. Not everyone can read and write in Hindi in India. So it's unlikely that deaf people can ever acquire Hindi because not everyone speaks it and they don't have exposure to it at home in the family. Sign language is deaf Indians' first language. If they have a good foundation in sign language, then it's possible for them to learn English as a second language. They don't need to pass through the Hindi language, but they need to have that strong foundation of their first language to be able to learn English as a second language.
And also follows on from the previous person's question about the teaching of Hindi. But I want to focus on the teaching of sign language. You mentioned that there is some variation, dialectical variation, in Indian Sign Language. And so I wonder what the major differences are between the north and the south of India, particularly where they speak Tamil. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that further.
Of the student's first language, sign language. One sees variation in our sign languages between the north and the south, or in different regions, as well as we see the variations in the English that we teach. So we don't consider it a problem that there are variations either in English or in sign language. And we don't see miscommunications between deaf people in the north and the south with different dialects of sign language, and accept it just as fully as we accept variations in English. Sometimes it's true, it's difficult for hearing people who are learning sign language to adapt to the regional variations, but for deaf people, deaf signers, it's no problem at all.